Stand in the center of Bradford, Pennsylvania, just before sunrise, and the first thing you notice isn't the factory, it's the silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, steel begins to speak. A stamping press strikes, another answers, grinding wheels wake, and the smell of hot metal and cutting oil drifts into the morning air. For more than a century, millions of knives have left this small American town. Yet the greatest threat to the company that made them never came from foreign competitors, cheap imports, or changing technology. It came from a decision made hundreds of miles away in a corporate boardroom by people who never forged a blade. Before that story unfolded, there was a different America. In 1889, the American frontier had largely disappeared, but the demand for dependable tools had not. Farmers, railroad workers, lumbermen, oil drillers, and mechanics all depended on a folding knife that simply worked every single day. Most knives of the era were ordinary commodities, easily replaced and quickly forgotten. The Case brothers saw an opportunity to build something different. They didn't promise the sharpest blade or the lowest price. They promised consistency. That promise eventually became two small letters stamped into steel, XX. To most customers, the mark looked like a simple trademark. In reality, it represented a manufacturing philosophy. Every blade was heat-treated twice before leaving the factory, and those two X's became a silent guarantee that the steel had earned the right to carry the Case name. As America's industrial economy accelerated into the 20th century, that promise became far more valuable than advertising. Trust spread from one pocket to another, one hardware store to the next, until the company outgrew its early workshops and established itself in Bradford, a town perfectly suited for manufacturing. Railroads moved raw materials in and finished knives out. Nearby industries supplied skilled labor. More importantly, Bradford developed something no balance sheet could measure: generations of manufacturing knowledge. Building a case knife was never a single operation. Every blade passed through well over 100 individual steps before reaching a customer's hand. Steel was stamped, ground, hardened, polished, fitted, assembled, inspected, sharpened, and inspected again. The result wasn't just another pocket knife. It was a product whose reputation depended on thousands of tiny decisions being made correctly, every single day. That reputation followed the company into the First World War, where dependable knives became military tools instead of everyday accessories. It survived economic depressions, changing fashions, and an increasingly competitive market because the value of a case knife wasn't measured by how it looked in a display case. It was measured years later, when it still opened smoothly after thousands of uses. By the middle of the 20th century, Case had achieved something few manufacturers ever manage. Customers no longer bought only the product, they bought confidence. The small XX stamp carried enough credibility that the knife itself became a symbol of American craftsmanship. It seemed almost impossible that such trust could ever be lost. But history has a habit of testing promises more severely than furnaces ever could. In the next chapter, that test would arrive not through war, recession, or foreign competition, but through a single business transaction that changed the future of one of America's most respected manufacturing brands. A business transaction rarely makes headlines for ordinary customers. A knife still looks like a knife. The blade still folds. The logo remains the same. The factory may even stay in the same town. From the outside, nothing appears to have changed. But inside a manufacturing company built on trust, ownership can quietly alter everything. In 1972, the Case family sold W.R. Case & Sons to American Brands Incorporated, a massive conglomerate whose portfolio stretched from cigarettes and liquor to golf equipment and consumer goods. To the executives reviewing financial reports, Case was not a legacy of American craftsmanship. It was another asset expected to generate stronger returns. Their logic was neither irrational nor malicious. Every corporation answers to shareholders, and every acquisition is expected to improve profitability. The easiest way to accomplish that goal is rarely by raising prices. It is by lowering costs. At first, the changes were subtle enough that most customers noticed nothing. Production became faster, manufacturing tolerances widened, finishing operations were simplified. Materials that had once been selected with extraordinary care slowly gave way to less expensive alternatives. None of these decisions seemed catastrophic in isolation. A few seconds saved on grinding, a slightly cheaper handle material, less time spent on polishing, better output on quarterly reports. But craftsmanship does not disappear all at once. It erodes one small compromise at a time. For decades, the value of a case knife had rested on remarkable consistency. A customer who bought one in the 1950s expected the next one to feel almost identical years later. During the late 1970s and into the 1980s, that expectation began to break. Collectors noticed blades with slight side-to-side movement. Springs no longer sat perfectly flush. Fit and finish became less predictable. The famous XX stamp still appeared on every tang, but increasingly, long-time buyers felt the mark represented a history the knife was struggling to live up to. What made the decline so damaging was not that Case suddenly produced bad knives. Many remained perfectly functional tools. The problem was that the company had built its reputation on being better than merely functional. It had promised precision, consistency, and confidence. Once customers began questioning whether every knife deserved that reputation, the company's greatest competitive advantage started to weaken. Trust, accumulated over nearly 70 years, proved far easier to lose than to earn. Ironically, the Bradford factory itself had not forgotten how to build great knives. The machinery still operated. Skilled workers still assembled blades by hand. The manufacturing knowledge still existed within the walls of the plant. What changed was the definition of success. For generations, success meant producing the finest knife possible. Under corporate ownership, success increasingly meant producing the finest knife that still satisfied financial targets. That distinction was almost invisible on a spreadsheet, yet it became painfully obvious in the hands of collectors who had spent decades carrying case knives. Without realizing it, one of America's most respected manufacturing brands had entered the most dangerous period of its history. The factory remained open, the products continued shipping, and the famous XX mark never disappeared. But the promise behind it was beginning to fade, and rebuilding that promise would prove far more difficult than preserving it in the first place. Brands rarely recover the moment customers lose confidence. Most continue selling products for years, slowly consuming the reputation built by previous generations until the name itself no longer means anything. By the late 1980s, Case was approaching that point. Among collectors, certain production years had quietly become years to avoid. Older knives, sometimes decades old and visibly worn from use, were commanding higher prices than brand-new models sitting in hardware store display cases. That reversal revealed a harsh truth. Customers were no longer paying for the knife in front of them. They were paying for the memory of what the brand used to represent. The decline wasn't dramatic enough to trigger headlines or bankruptcy proceedings, but it was steadily damaging something far more valuable than quarterly profits. Every disappointing knife weakened confidence in the next one. Every compromise made it easier for buyers to look elsewhere. The company had spent nearly a century building trust one blade at a time, yet only a few years of inconsistent quality were enough to make loyal customers question every purchase. American brands eventually recognized that Case no longer fit its long-term strategy. In 1988, the company sold W.R. Case & Sons to James F. Parker, a respected knife collector and dealer from Tennessee. The sale mattered not because Parker possessed some revolutionary manufacturing technology, but because he understood what the previous owner had underestimated. The real product wasn't steel, bone, or brass. It was confidence. Restoring that confidence required more than improving production numbers. It required convincing customers that the famous XX mark once again stood for uncompromising quality. Parker began pushing manufacturing back toward the standards collectors expected. Quality control received greater attention. Finishing improved. Traditional patterns regained the consistency that had made Case famous. The recovery, however, was anything but instant. Trust follows a different timeline than production. A factory can improve in months. A reputation often takes years. In 1990, ownership changed again when Parker sold the company to River Associates. Another transfer might have sounded like more uncertainty, but this time, the brand was no longer sliding downhill. It was stabilizing. Then, in 1993, the turning point finally arrived. Zippo Manufacturing Company, located only a few miles from the Case factory in Bradford, acquired W.R. Case & Sons. Unlike a distant conglomerate managing dozens of unrelated businesses, Zippo understood exactly what it meant to manufacture iconic American products. Both companies had built their reputations not through aggressive advertising, but through consistency that survived generation after generation. Zippo recognized that Case's greatest asset wasn't the factory buildings or the machinery inside them. It was the belief that a product made in Bradford should never force its owner to question whether it deserved its name. Instead of treating Case as another financial asset, Zippo treated it as a legacy worth protecting. Investment flowed back into the factory. Equipment was modernized without abandoning traditional manufacturing methods, and quality once again became the company's primary objective rather than a variable in a cost calculation. The recovery was gradual, but collectors noticed. Newer knives began earning the same respect once reserved only for older production years. The XX stamp slowly regained the authority it had lost. After 2 decades of uncertainty, Case had finally rediscovered something no acquisition contract could ever purchase outright: the trust of the people who carried its knives every day. By the early 2000s, Case was no longer fighting to survive. It faced a different challenge, proving that American manufacturing could still compete in a world racing toward lower costs. Across the cutlery industry, production was moving overseas. Companies that had once proudly advertised domestic craftsmanship increasingly sourced blades, components, or complete knives from factories thousands of miles away. Lower labor costs, larger production volumes, and global supply chains made the financial argument almost impossible to ignore. Consumers enjoyed lower prices, investors welcomed stronger margins, and one historic American manufacturer after another abandoned the factories that had built their reputations. Case resisted that trend. The company understood that its identity had never been based on producing the cheapest knife on the shelf. Customers who chose a Case knife were buying something different: continuity. Many of its most recognizable patterns, the Trapper, Stockman, Peanut, and Sodbuster, had remained fundamentally unchanged for decades. A grandfather could hand his knife to his grandson, and the younger generation would instantly recognize both its shape and its purpose. That kind of continuity is difficult to manufacture and impossible to outsource. It depends on preserving standards that survive changes in fashion, ownership, and technology. Zippo invested heavily in making sure those standards remained inside Bradford. Modern equipment improved efficiency where it made sense, but automation never replaced the craftsmanship that defined the finished product. Precision machines could cut steel faster than ever before, yet final fitting, inspection, sharpening, and assembly still depended on experienced hands capable of recognizing imperfections that computers often overlooked. The objective was not to turn Case into a museum. It was to ensure that modernization strengthened quality instead of replacing it. The company came closest to testing that philosophy in 2011 with the introduction of the Tech X line. Unlike traditional case knives, these modern tactical designs were manufactured in China. The announcement immediately sparked debate among collectors who feared the company was preparing to abandon its American roots. Case responded by drawing a clear boundary. Tech X would remain a separate product line, and the classic knives that had built the company's reputation would continue to be manufactured in Bradford. More importantly, the traditional Case name itself stayed attached to American-made production. It was a subtle decision, but one with enormous symbolic importance. After spending decades rebuilding confidence, the company refused to blur the distinction between its heritage and its experiments. That choice demonstrated a lesson learned from the previous generation. Customers could accept innovation, they could accept new materials and improved machinery. What they would never accept again was uncertainty about what the Case name actually promised. By protecting that promise, instead of stretching it, the company preserved something far more valuable than market share. It preserved clarity. In an industry where countless brands had become difficult to distinguish from one another, Case remained instantly recognizable, not because it was frozen in the past, but because it knew exactly which traditions were worth carrying into the future. More than a century after the first Case knives were sold, the company's greatest advantage no longer comes from being the oldest or the most famous. It comes from surviving the mistakes that have erased countless other American manufacturers. History has shown that factories do not disappear overnight. They fade when quality becomes negotiable, when trust is treated as a marketing slogan instead of an obligation, and when short-term efficiency slowly replaces long-term reputation. Case experienced that decline firsthand, and perhaps because of it, the company emerged with a clearer understanding of what its name actually represents. That lesson became especially relevant as global supply chains grew increasingly fragile. Rising transportation costs, geopolitical tensions, and changing trade policies exposed the hidden risks behind decades of offshoring. Companies that had optimized every dollar of production suddenly faced disruptions they could neither predict nor control. Manufacturers that had retained domestic production discovered an advantage that rarely appeared on financial statements: resilience. Because its traditional knives had remained in Bradford, Case did not need to rebuild a manufacturing culture from scratch. The knowledge had never left. The skilled workforce had never completely disappeared. The production methods continued evolving without abandoning the standards that made the brand valuable in the first place. Today, every Case knife carries more than steel, brass, and bone. It carries the accumulated experience of generations who solved the same manufacturing problems over and over until consistency became routine. That is why collectors often judge a Case knife differently from an ordinary cutting tool. They are not simply evaluating edge retention or handle materials. They are evaluating whether the latest knife deserves to stand beside those made 50 or even 100 years earlier. Few companies willingly accept that challenge because few products are expected to compete with their own history. Case has no choice. Every new knife is measured against every knife that came before it. That burden is also its greatest strength. It forces the company to think beyond quarterly reports and temporary market trends. A poor decision might increase profits this year, but it could weaken a reputation built across generations. The story of Case, then, is not ultimately about pocket knives. It is about the extraordinary difficulty of preserving trust in an economy that constantly rewards compromise. Many businesses can manufacture a blade. Far fewer can manufacture confidence. Even fewer can lose that confidence, earn it back, and protect it for another generation. Walk through Bradford today, and the sounds are familiar. Steel still meets steel. Grinding wheels still shape blades. Inspection benches still reject work that falls short of the standard. Modern machines have changed the speed of production, but they have not changed the expectation attached to the small XX mark stamped into every traditional case knife. More than a century after it first appeared, those two letters continue to represent something remarkably simple: a promise that the next knife deserves the same trust as the last. In American manufacturing, few promises have been tested more severely. Fewer still have survived.